I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today we hear on the ground from the battlefields of the Donbas. Consider the breaking reports that the US and UK are, at last, about to give Kyiv permission for long-range strikes deeper into Russia, and discuss the outline of the Western strategy for a possible peace.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 11th of September, 2 years and 205 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our Associate Editor of Defence, Dominic Nicholls, our Senior Foreign Correspondent, Roland Oliphant, and on the ground near Pokrovsk, freelance journalist Tom Mutch. Before we begin, just a short word to reiterate our gratitude for the continued messages of support and appreciation for David's life and work following his sudden passing. All of your messages will be compiled and shared with his family in due course. And Roland offers his memories of David at the end of this episode. And you'll hear more about his passions beyond Ukraine, which were rich and eclectic. But first, as ever, over to Dom for the military updates in Ukraine and Russia.
Thanks, Francis, and hello, team. First, I'd like to extend our thoughts to our US friends today, 23 years after the 9/11 attacks. I was on operations in Macedonia alongside US forces on that day, then in Iraq and Afghanistan as a direct consequence, again alongside the US. And I just thought this morning, out of that terrible day, I made some very long-lasting friendships. That thought I felt was appropriate this week. Anyway, onto the news. Ukrainian forces recently advanced in Kursk Oblast amid the continued offensive operations there yesterday. Geolocated footage published on Monday shows Ukrainian forces advancing to eastern Komarovka, or the east of Komarovka. That's about 40 k's northwest of Sudzha. That's further into that wedge that's bounded by the border with Ukraine to the south and the west, and the river and the high ground to the north. So they seem to be pushing west. They also made some territorial gains in the vicinity of Koronovo. That's just to the north. However, related and somewhat confusingly, there are reports of a Russian counterattack in the area. It's only taken them 6 weeks to get their elbows in gear. Apti Aludinov, who's a Chechen commander, he's got his own Telegram channel. He said that Russia has retaken several settlements in Kursk Oblast, Ukraine. Not commented on those claims. Aludinov said Russian forces are in Snagost. Now that is about 4 k's east of Komarovka, i.e. back toward the Ukrainian-held bit of Russia. Again, never tire of saying that. Now, that is possible because the geolocated footage I've just referred to was from Monday, but I've not seen any other credible reports of that kind of movement by Russian forces yet. But we'll obviously keep an eye on that. Now, sticking inside Russia, a freight train and 11 cars was derailed by a blast in Belgorod Oblast earlier today as a result of, quote, illegal interference, according to Governor... Sorry, that's Roland ripping bits out of the paper you can hear in the background. Yes. Illegal interference, according to Governor Vyacheslav Gladkov. Now, Belgorod Oblast borders Ukraine, but the area this happened, this derailment, this blast, is not right on the border. The area is it starts about 10 k further inland, further into Russia. The blast, we think, was about 40 k's inside Russia, and this whole area, the area in question, about 100 k's northeast of Kharkiv. Russian authorities said that all the train and the cars were empty and no casualties. Now, the Baza channel on Telegram said that the train derailment was because of an explosion on the tracks. There has obviously been this kind of thing before. We know the Ukrainian military intelligence have been, they've put their hand up to a few such attacks. There's also thought to be a number of partisans in the area and so on and so forth. We don't know yet, but Baza's saying this was an explosion on the tracks. And the Russian Okay, bingo cards ready, folks. The Russian committee described the incident as a, well done, terrorist attack and opened a criminal case. Now into Ukraine. Russian forces recently made small advances near Crimea and Siversk. They're both roughly 40-50 k's north of Bakhmut, and also in the area of Toretsk and Pokrovsk down in the Donbas. It looks like that reinforcement that we spoke of last week by, I think, three Ukrainian brigades is slowing and reversing in a few small places the Russian advance towards Pokrovsk, but certainly the mighty Russian army has not got that much closer to Pokrovsk in the last couple of weeks. Now, Russia also today struck the city of Konstantinivka. That's about 10 km southwest of Chasiv Yar in Donetsk Oblast. Twice today. The last one about an hour ago. There was a blast about an hour before that. And then a second blast, possibly a bit longer than what we've seen in their usual double taps, trying to get the emergency services that respond to the first blast, but could well be connected. There were civilian deaths and injuries there. More casualties, civilian casualties in other strikes in Chernihiv, Dnipro, Petrovsk and Kherson Oblast. Ukraine's air defences say they shot down 20 of 25 Shahed-type drones launched by Russia overnight. 5 drones, the Air Force said, were reportedly lost in Ukrainian territory and did not reach their targets. That seems to be code these days for electronic warfare brought them down, but they weren't shot down, they were brought down by EW, we think. Russia was also thought to have attacked Ukraine with an Iskander-M ballistic missile, 2 S-300 anti-aircraft guided missiles and 6 Kh-31P anti-radar missiles. Cherkasy, Kharkiv, Kyiv, Luhansk, Mykolaiv, Sumy, Poltava and Zaporizhia Oblast also came under attack, but no casualties reported by authorities there. And that's us up to date, Francis.
Thanks, Dom. Now, before we turn to possible major developments about storm shadows, I want to go to Tom on the ground in Donbas for his sense of the situation there. Tom, thank you very much for your time today. Where do you want to start?
Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction. And before I begin, again, I just really like to offer my most heartfelt commiserations for the loss of David, a truly extraordinary loss that nobody could have predicted. If there is any sort of, I guess, silver lining, it is the fact that he really did, that he put his heart and soul into this podcast and he left behind a very, very valuable and genuine legacy. And I predict that this will become something of a historical document for anyone who wants to study the war in detail, because there's just so much good information that's been said here. And so by continuing this, you really are doing the best to honour his legacy. Now, on to Pokrovsk. I was in Pokrovsk with a team that were evacuating the last sort of stragglers and civilians on Sunday. I spent the whole day there, and I was actually more surprised, not so much by what I saw as what I did not see. So anyone who's been in, the good comparison is in Bakhmut. When the fight was going from it really for full force, you would go there and absolutely every street in the city was fortified. There were sandbags, tank traps everywhere. There were soldiers all over the place. There were basements that you knew were bunkers. In Pokrovsk, you got there and you really didn't feel like this was an extraordinarily well fortified city. What I was almost even more concerned about was that they're a little bit behind Pokrovsk, between Dnipro, which is, depending on your estimate, about the third biggest city in Ukraine, which sits on the Dnipro River. There is one major town, it's called Pavlohrad, which is currently being used as a logistics point, and it's getting hit by Russian rockets basically every day now. And that is basically the one big population centre between Pokrovsk and Dnipro. I drove down that road, and I'm not going to lie that I didn't see a single fortification. I didn't see a trench. I didn't see any of the normal things that you would see other than a few checkpoints. And I was a little bit like, what on earth is going on here? I remember I did a similar mission to Kherson about 1 month ago. And even though Kherson's been liberated, and the drive from Mykolaiv to Kherson, there are extraordinarily fresh, well-dug trench lines everywhere. They have the authorities there have really taken the time to make sure that it's as well fortified as it can possibly be. between Pokrovsk, which could potentially fall in the coming months, and straight on to Pavlohrad and then to Dnipro, there really is not very much. Now, in terms of the actual military situation there, people have been saying the Russian offensive has stalled. I don't think stalled is really the right word. Instead, it seems like they're slightly changing direction and trying to work on their flanks, particularly their southern flank. So they're now attempting to assault or encircle smaller towns like Seladove, Ukrainsk, which they've already apparently captured a fairly large part of, and Kurakove. And if they would really ideally like to get those out of the way so that they can then go from the north down to Vuhledar. Now, Vuhledar has been a major thorn in the Russian side. It's a fortress that's withstood a large number of Russian assaults ever really towards the start of the full-scale invasion. And it's also been some of the sites of some of the Russians' most sort of ignominious defeats. So taking that would be a real propaganda coup for the Kremlin. But I want to come back to, as I said, my initial worry about Pokrovsk, which has been, look, the Ukrainian strategy, as far as anyone can basically see it in the Donbas, to the extent that it has been articulated, is that effectively they want the Russians to be able to hit their heads against the sort of series of fortress cities that they had in a row, right? Bakhmut, Chasiv Yar, Kostiantynivka, and that eventually they would get to the fortress agglomeration, as it's called, of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. Extremely well dug in, extremely well fortified cities, the sort of the major Ukrainian settlements that remain in the Donbas. And if they got close to those, while it would be a humanitarian emergency, the Ukrainians could probably hold them, considering how well fortified they are. The real worry is if they decide to go from Pokrovsk and then just keep going east. It's flat, open steppe and terrain. There really would not be very much. There's sort of a soft underbelly that Ukraine seems to have left undefended. That was really my major concern coming back from the trip.
That's so fascinating, Tom. Thank you for that really intricate insight. I'm just going to put one question to you before opening this up to Dom and Roland, which is, there's been some analysis from military experts in the West that have suggested that the situation in Pokrovsk and Donbas may not be as severe as some of the most dire warnings about the situation. And there were some who condemned the Kursk incursion because they said that it moved vital resources and crack troops from where they were needed in Donbas. I just wondered whether you had any reflections on that, whether you think this is still basically, to be frank, a Donbas collapse is about to take place in certain critical places, or whether you think that perhaps there is some suggestion that Ukraine gets how it's fighting there and that perhaps there is an understanding about the best way forward. I'm very interested in your perspective on that question.
So I think the narrative of collapse is, it's a problem because I think often us journalists are at fault because, you know, the idea of small incremental advances doesn't get the same kind of headlines as the idea of a collapse of the front, whether it's a collapse on a disastrous collapse of the Ukrainian front or a triumphant Ukrainian breakthrough of the Russian front. The idea of a collapse doesn't happen. You know, the idea of a sort of a slow grinding wearing down of the enemy just isn't as interesting. No, I don't think a collapse of the Donbas front is imminent. However, it does seem that the Russians have the forces in the area to gradually push the Ukrainians back in the areas, in the Pokrovsk direction, all of the areas that they're going towards, Pokrovsk, Seladove, Kurakove, and that if we look at it from a perspective of, say, over the next 6 months, they could have a really significant, strategically important chunk of territory there. Will it have cost them a huge amount of soldiers and materiel? Undoubtedly, but they seem to have pretty large stocks to draw from. And I think one of the problems in earlier analysis of the war is that people underestimated just how many Russians would be willing to sign up to the army. It looks like even though they're having to slowly raise recruitment bonuses and pay levels, they're still getting around about 25,000 a month, which is enough to replenish their losses. And I'm not convinced yet that the Ukrainian General Staff has a strategy to stem that tide as of yet.
Thank you very much, Tom. Really interesting to hear your perspective on that question. Dom, Roland, just want to bring you here on this. Really a critical place, Donbas, for all sorts of reasons that Tom's just been articulating. What are your reactions to what you've just heard?
Yeah, thanks, Francis. It's I've got a question for Tom, if I may, and it's about this supposed reinforcement by Ukraine of Pokrovsk. I've heard the figure of 3 brigades, although whether it's 3 and quite what size a brigade is these days, who really knows? But it sounds as if they have pushed additional resource in there, and that has partly stemmed the tide of advance and forced this move, as Tom's saying, to the south and southwest towards Volodar, or in that area. I don't know if they're ever going to be able to link up, but sort of, instead of going direct for Pokrovsk, they've had to start shifting a little bit to the southwest. I just wondered, Tom, from your view, how big a force was that? Did it take much to divert this Russian force that we think is largely meat assaults, artillery pounds the area, little men run in afterwards and stick a flag on top of the rubble? But how much effort did it take to actually derail that kind of steamroller?
Okay, so one of the difficulties is that when people say, a brigade has been pushed in somewhere, often it's not actually the full brigade. It's only, as we know, sort of elements of the brigade. So there was a National Guard brigade that was pushed in. The name of it escapes me at the moment, but I believe it was only about 2,000 soldiers, and that did help stem the Russian advance. There have also been improvements in other areas of the front. Some of I think there were elements of 3rd Assault Brigade that were managed to recapture important parts of New York, that settlement just to the north, and I think bits of Toretsk were liberated as well. Again, I'm not sure this has necessarily stopped the Russian steamroller as the steamroller continues south, and I would say that if the Russians wanted to mount a proper assault on Pokrovsk, they're probably doing the right strategy, which is to try and widen their flanks and not overextend themselves. Russian logistics were a huge problem for them earlier in the war, but it seems like this could be an example of them learning their lesson on that. But it's still early days when it comes to the battle for Pokrovsk, and we probably won't know the full answers to this for months.
Hello, Tom. Thanks for that. That was fascinating. It's Roland here. I've got 2 questions, really, no particular order. You were talking there about the situation around Krakow and Volodar. I just pulled up the deep state map, and it's actually, there's a really worrying looking, almost encirclement developing around a place near Krakow, Hirnik, on as you said, on the southern side of this Russian salient, really. I was wondering if you've heard anything about that. That's definitely it's one thing I've half had an eye on for a couple of weeks or two. Have you heard anything about that, about whether the Ukrainians are trying to hold that, whether they're trying to pull back a little bit to straighten the line? Because looking at the control map, it's a clearly vulnerable place.
So that pocket, it's, I believe, Novoselsky or something. I'm probably butchering the name here. Yes, it does look like a pocket could be developing there. Now, I spent most of this trip with volunteers and not with the military, and they said that they had heard that the Ukrainian forces were pulling back. Now, I just want to clarify, that's not coming directly from the military themselves. That's coming from a guy who spoke to a guy who spoke to a guy. So that's definitely not a gospel claim, but that would make sense. Also, the territory there, it's quite a large chunk of grass, but it's not necessarily anything extraordinarily important. There aren't any really major settlements there, nothing particularly strategic in terms of logistics there. So it probably would make sense for the Ukrainians to pull out rather than risk getting into a cauldron there.
Thanks for that. Really useful. It's definitely something for us to all keep an eye on. And lastly, you were talking a little bit about the kind of sense of Pokrovsk, and you were talking about you were comparing it to Bakhmut. And I remember that myself, driving around Bakhmut and seeing all those tank traps and all those preparations in the build-up. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about Pokrovsk, but from a kind of, I mean, what does the city feel like? Is it completely empty? Is it being hit by rockets every day? Is it at that kind of surprising stage where there's more life around than you imagine? Because we know, I mean, we were speaking to people there, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago, over the past couple of weeks, about, packing up and leaving and so on. What's the, I don't know, what's the kind of the civilian, the human, just the picture of life there right now from what you saw?
Very dark, very solemn, with a few odd exceptions that I will come to. So the city is, I wouldn't say completely deserted, but it's very devoid of life. There are not very many people there. There are police cars that are driving around the streets. They have these loudspeakers that are basically saying, get out now, it's going to get worse, and giving the numbers of the evacuation teams, which are mostly volunteer, that will come in and where to meet these people and where to pick them up. As normal, it's often, because you see the people that turn up to these evacuation buses, they're often elderly, they're often quite sick, in some cases disabled, and they need special help to get out. They're people that really often don't really have anywhere else to go, and a lot of them left almost unwillingly. They maybe did so because of the absolute pleading of their family members who are safer in the west of Ukraine. It's not a wrecked city yet, which I think you can hear a lot of artillery going off, but there's a few places like, you drive past the Nova Poshta, it's been blown up. You drive past the old hotel that everyone used to stay in, it's a wreck. But there's not the sort of widespread destruction on the streets that you see, even really in Kherson, but not the sort of, it doesn't look like a Bakhmut or a Mariupol or anything like that yet. It's still more or less intact. The one very strange thing I did see was I was wandering around, there's a park, and the park's completely deserted, still quite nicely kept. Someone's still trimming the grass and there's still flowers growing. And the park's totally empty. There's a children's playground, it's totally empty. And then I got to a volleyball court, and there were a group of young people. There was 3 young guys and a young woman. The young woman gave me her age, wouldn't give me her name, wouldn't let me take a photograph or anything. Who she said she was 24. They were all young, in very good condition, looked very, very happy. I was kind of like, what are you guys doing here? And she's like, oh, this is our home. We don't really want to leave. We'll be fine. The Russians aren't here. And I'm just thinking, it was just such a bizarre sight. And then they just started playing volleyball, and you could hear the thunk of the girl hitting the ball, and then you hear the bang in the background from an artillery thing going off, and they was just there without a care in the world. Now, often, as I say, most of the people there are sick or elderly, but it was just very bizarre to see these 4 young people perfectly in the sort of prime of their life, looking very healthy, just playing volleyball in the middle of a war zone without a care in the world. I'll leave you with that thought.
Thank you, everyone. Now, Roland, let's turn to the major political news of today. You were at the Foreign Office yesterday and gave us that update from the room with Antony Blinken, who was in conversation with David Lammy. A lot has happened since then, with him and the British Foreign Secretary now arriving in Kyiv together. What are you hearing? What are the reports this morning that could be very significant?
Yeah, absolutely. So we knew they were going. They announced they were on their way to Kyiv. Presumably they flew to Poland, and they were obviously on the overnight train from Poland to Kyiv last night. They arrived about 11:30 local time. Now, when I spoke to Dom and you chaps on the podcast yesterday, just after coming out of the press conference, I said something along the lines of, well, reading between the lines here, maybe we will see a shift in the position on whether or not the Ukrainians will be allowed to fire long-range missiles into Russia, whether the United States in particular will be willing to lift that ban. I very strongly caveated it. I said, well, maybe in the coming weeks or something, we might see a shift. Even before press time, we were getting sources, our US team were getting lines that made it very clear that is what's on the table. In fact, this is the FT. They published this report, it was 10 hours ago this morning, so when I was already in bed asleep. Joe Biden was asked, are you considering a request by Ukraine to use weapons provided by the US to deep strike inside Russian territory? We're working that out right now, Biden said when asked by reporters. Now, the FT adds that the US government is split over that question. The State Department is much more bullish about it, apparently. According to the FT, the Pentagon and the intelligence community are a bit more cautious about that decision. But it's now absolutely clear. It's been reported from multiple sources. Joe Barnes has been speaking to sources, the Ukrainian sources as well. This is the big question, right? So Antony Blinken and David Lammy are basically in Kyiv to talk to Volodymyr Zelensky and other members of the Ukrainian leadership about lifting that restriction. I think it might not happen today. It could happen today, who knows? But we know that Keir Starmer and Joe Biden are having this summit in Washington on Friday. It's a surprise summit to discuss strategic matters. And we know that the British government has basically let it be known that they've been lobbying the Americans for this permission to lift these restrictions. So I think probably all the signals are those restrictions are going to be lifted. Ukraine is going to be able to fire long-range weapons into Russia. Which weapons are we talking about? Telegraph being Her Majesty's Telegraph, and obsessed with waving the Union Jack, where we keep talking about Storm Shadows in our headline. Yes, a Storm Shadow missile is one of them. The other big one is the ATACMS, the long-range American precision missile. But the point is, as Don was making just before we came on air, it's not the weapon, it's the policy that counts here. There's also the question of the German Taurus missiles, which Germany still hasn't released. The point is any weapon that the West provides, we think, probably with certain caveats still, will be, the Ukrainians will have the permission to fire that into Russia. Probably, I mean, I don't know. Where would I put a time on it, Francis? I mean, maybe by the end of the week, maybe by the end of this afternoon. I'm not sure. And that's the big thing. There's more stuff going on here, which I think is quite interesting. But that's the really big question debate of this diplomatic moment.
Thanks, Roland, and feedback welcome from our American listeners regarding your Joe Biden impersonation. As you say, it feels like a big development, this. The justification being, as you say, that after it emerged, Iran is now arming Russia with ballistic missiles, that thereby a response was required. If that is true, then many would argue it is yet another example of the West conceding the strategic initiative to Moscow and its allies, and of being reactive rather than proactive, a hallmark of this conflict. But as we've seen countless times, the fear of escalation in and of itself is escalatory, as is the delay between Western indecision and finally decision, because the Kremlin has time to ponder and prepare for its next move. How many tragedies could have been avoided? How many so-called escalations had decisive and swift action been made within the first year of the war? But there we are. It is interesting, as you say, seeing the narrative regarding Storm Shadow permissions coming out of London this morning, shifting slowly. The British government is seemingly now urging Washington to grant permissions for Storm Shadows, which are used in tandem with US systems, of course, and therefore require, as you say, their permission too. But, and it's a big one, the understanding before now was that London had never formally requested those permissions. So was this a case of London not formally requesting them because they knew that Washington would say no and they wanted to avoid that embarrassment? Or were Washington inclined to say yes, but London never asked permission because of their own fears? We shall see. But all too predictably, Moscow has indicated that Russia will consider the US and its allies to be parties in the war if they allow Kyiv to use these long-range weapons for strikes inside Russia. But we've lost count the number of times that they've been saying this, with no further action taken on their part. The fact is, there is so much evidence that Moscow already sees itself as at war with the West, not least in its hostile acts of sabotage, assassination, and all the other examples of hybrid warfare that were serious enough to see the heads of the world's leading intelligence agencies go public this week, as we reported yesterday. Now, there are a few other political updates which I can turn to shortly, but Roland, any other thoughts on any of that and on this pretty massive story which has erupted within the past couple of hours?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right about being reactive for a start, and I think partly that's deliberate. I think it was clear when they announced that, okay, we've got intelligence that the Iranians have passed those missiles to the Russians, and from their own language, they're using language like this is a big escalation. They were using language that made it clear there had to be a response that went beyond the sanctions that they announced yesterday. So I think they signaled that quite well, and that does look reactive. But then again, look, if you think about, you were referring there to the kind of the debate about the red lines, making the case that self-deterrence is escalatory and so on. But the counter-argument from some in Washington is that no, we've got to be very careful about this. And I wonder whether the fact that this is basically being trailed, right? I mean, the Americans have let it be known, the Brits and the Americans have basically let it be known, like several days before it actually happens, that this decision is probably coming. That's a pretty nice present to the Russians, right? I mean, that gives the Russians all the time in the world to move potential targets out of range, to prepare for this thing incoming. That seems to me, the decision to do that rather than to suddenly there's a huge series of explosions across Russia, people think what the hell is going on, and then by the time we come on air a few hours later we go, oh, well, it seems like permission has been granted for the use of these weapons. It strikes me that way of doing it may be intended to address slightly those concerns about red lines. I did have conversations with British officials around this kind of thing, and the frank kind of line was that, yes, look, like there is this debate. There's always been this debate about the red lines, about what we think Russia's perception of something is and how Russia would respond to it. So it has always been there. We know it's been there. We know there have been excuses about it. It seems like there is a shift on this particular thing. But there's also, sorry, I know I'm rambling on, but there's a much bigger point here, I think, that we've got to get to, which is that one of the things that Blinken and Lamy both said at the press conference yesterday was about, look, we're going to Kyiv, we're going together. We're announcing it publicly, which we've never done before, that we're doing this. So it's a big show. It's a big show of American and British support. And they talked about we're going there to listen to what their objectives are, how to achieve those objectives, and what we can do to help them achieve those objectives. So they were talking about strategy to reach goals in a way that made me think they were speaking about more than just incrementally granting permission for deep-range strikes. And it sounds to me, you'll also have seen a report in, perhaps Reuters reported on Monday, actually. The White House has finally sent a strategy document to Congress. It's classified, we don't know what's in it, but it's a document they were obliged to provide, setting out the strategy for Ukraine, setting out their map for stuff. And we've got this big meeting between Starmer and Biden in Washington coming up. It just feels to me, given a lot of the other rhetoric we've had, given President Zelensky's talk about a second peace conference that Russia will be invited to, I wonder whether a big effort is now being made to hammer out, okay, how do we want this war to end and how are we going to get there? And that is something that's been absent, at least in public, from Western thinking throughout the war. I'm beginning to feel that there is a concerted decision to finally lay in a strategy, choose an outcome that you're trying to achieve and try and get to it, and potentially try and get to that outcome. I don't know. I mean, November 7th is quite close, isn't it? Possibly this year, possibly by spring.
Thank you very much, Roland, for those insights. I should add also that the Kremlin has just rejected reports that Iran is shipping missiles to Russia to be used in Ukraine, describing them as baseless accusations. Tehran has also called the claim ugly propaganda, which is surely the biggest indicator as to the truthfulness of the claims that one could ask for. Just another couple of bits of news. Donald Trump last night, in the major debate with him and Kamala Harris, refused to say whether he wants Ukraine to win the war. Asked if he supports Kyiv in its fight against Russia, Trump said, "I want the war to stop." He then went on to say that if he wins the election, he would negotiate a deal before becoming president, which, to be frank, sounds rather unconstitutional to me, but I'm no expert on the intricacies of the American system. Feedback welcome. I know Nixon was liaising with the Viet Cong before he was in office, but that was widely condemned when it broke, and indeed by many historians since. Just finally, I know David would have wanted us to acknowledge that today marks 2 years since Izium was liberated from Russian occupation, when Ukrainian troops reclaimed the town, revealing mass graves that laid bare the horrors of the Russian invasion, much as Bucha did early on. There are many more examples, but these are the names of atrocities that will go down in history, already singed as they are in the minds of those of us following this war. They were warnings of what would and are indeed continuing to take place in the occupied territories. Tom, thank you so much for your insights. I'll come to you very shortly for your final thoughts. But Dom, first, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. Just a quick dip back into thinking about David, if I may. Unfortunately, I've got a bit of muscle memory from times in the military, and I've suddenly lost colleagues and friends. And obviously, grief is a very personal thing, but I just want to briefly share where I am today, in case it chimes with anyone. I think I'm over the initial shock of the all-consuming news. Continue to be very grateful for support from everybody, and that includes you. I've just checked, 744 unread emails in my inbox. But today I got that feeling that you may recognise. I got that feeling that when I examined it, I recognised it as the first, if I describe it as the first twitchiness of annoyance that other people have returned to normal. I look at my colleagues and then I catch myself and I think, well, why wouldn't they? I mean, they're good people. They all acted and continue to act with great compassion, but they didn't know David as well as us. And I've had to keep reminding myself that others aren't experiencing what we are, that today is just another day for them, and that's perfectly okay. There's no great insights here, folks. I'm just asking you to look out for each other, recognise that we're all still adjusting, try to recognise the twitchiness of annoyance, if that's a thing, and make accommodation for it if you're able, and just be gentle. Just be gentle with yourself. I'm not, I stress I'm not a mental health professional, just trying to tell you what I'm going through. We'll chat again tomorrow, and of course for many, many days to come. But we're all still working through it.
Well, thank you, Dom. You spoke for all of us there. Roland, over to you next.
Francis, I still can't manage to press the unmute button quick enough. I'm sorry. Listen, look, really following on from Dom, to be honest, I've waited a few days, and this is quite selfish, really. I wanted my chance to say my piece about David. I think, like Dom, I'm through that initial kind of being hit for 6-bit, and everyone's coming to terms with stuff. And I must say, before I get into kind of the things I wanted to say, and I've written quite a lot, so I might have to curtail it. It's funny, isn't it? There was a lot of grief and shock on Monday, and then I remember coming in on Tuesday morning, which was only yesterday actually, and there was Charles Gear sitting next to David's desk with a big grin on his face and all these sunflowers on David's desk and so on. And it was this remarkable transformation from the shock had been there, and then suddenly we all remembered who he was, and there was this glorious feeling of being united in love, really, for a really amazing guy. So, look, a lot of stuff has been said about David. I'm sure maybe listeners are getting tired. I'm sure they won't. But a lot of things have been said, and there are some common themes about what have been said about David, which I thought I'd pick out. A lot of the things, if you look at the incredible number of tributes on our online book of condolences, you'll see the themes. It's that he was a curious person, he was kind, he was thoughtful, and he was modest. As has been said several times, it was like he had no ego. He was interested in everything, and one of the reasons that we've got such an incredible response is because of all the communities he was part of. He was a theologian, he was a chorist, he was obsessed with, he played the mandolin, Joe Barnes spoke about him talking about cricket, which I love. He was a great Tolkienist. The thing I used to talk to him about was Warhammer 40,000, actually. Now, if you don't know what Warhammer 40,000 is, and Dom didn't until me and David explained it to him.
I made the silly mistake of saying, what's Warhammer? Oh.
Look, the basic thing you need to know in this context is Warhammer 40,000 is silly, it's fun, and it also has this deliberately and, in fact, very over-the-top, satirical, dark edge to it. And there's something about it that kind of attracts the curious-minded and the imaginative, and David was all of that. And in the grim darkness of the far future, that provided ample material for wry observations about our own current predicament on this planet and in this century, and indeed in this war. And that curiosity brings me to another thing. News can be a very cynical trade. You can easily get the idealism knocked out of you at quite an early age in this profession. You'll get told that's not a story, readers aren't interested in this, the editor isn't interested in that. You can develop quite a thick skin. And David, either he resisted it or he had been lucky enough to avoid that, but he was as curious about the world, as interested in everything as you remembered that you were at one point. And it reminded you that it was okay to be like that. You'd find yourself having a conversation, he'd say something like, I think that's really interesting. Yeah, we should do that. yeah, we should definitely do that. And someone else would say, really? I don't think that. He said, why not? Nothing's going to stop us. We had this podcast. It was an amazing opportunity. And the other thing, so that's one thing that comes through. And the other thing that I didn't know about David until relatively recently, alongside all of those things, he was actually quite a committed Christian. He was an Anglican. And one of the most thoughtful and affecting interviews I ever heard him do was when he interviewed Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury. And the thing is, journalism sometimes gives you this amazing opportunity, this privilege to sit down with people who you admire, who you want to see. And he told me after that, he said, look, it was amazing. I got to sit down with the head of my church and basically put really knotty, difficult questions to him about questions of forgiveness and how to deal with that in this war and so on. And then he admitted to me, he said, even better, do you know what, Roland? He got a biblical citation wrong and I corrected him. So it was incredible. David was able to say, I think you've got that wrong. I think that's the other psalm. And I know that because it's my favourite psalm. David corrected the Archbishop of Canterbury, which I think is slightly marvellous. Now, I get into a bit tricky territory. I'm not a religious man, to be absolutely honest. But David was, and J.R.R. Tolkien, who he also loved, was as well. And this is not immediately my fault. I'm indebted to Neil Walsh, who wrote in a tribute on our online book of condolences, that David lived his life, according to this quote of Tolkien's, that it's the small everyday deeds of ordinary folk that keep the darkness at bay, small acts of kindness and love. And it occurred to me that the common thread linking all the tributes to David and all the things that we've said about him, that many of our listeners have said about him, is that he embodied those rather hobbit-like virtues. And I say that not just because he was slightly short, but those old-fashioned, perhaps not fashionable virtues, but modesty, courage, concern for others, forgiveness, mercy, those things which I suppose, let's just say it, those are quite Christian virtues, but they're eternal virtues, and they underpin all of our own moral compasses and our sense of what is good. And quite honestly, I think that may be why his death has affected so many people and affected us all in the way it has, because you might not be able to write down a dictionary definition of goodness and decency, but you know it when you saw it, and it was in David. And if I may, at the risk of droning on a little bit, there is another, I could say the same with his journalism. So this podcast, which I feel incredibly privileged to be a part of, and which I absolutely wouldn't ever have been a part of if it wasn't for David. Yes, it's a podcast. Yes, it's a product of the 21st century world of social media and the internet and new media and so on. But I'm afraid to say it's pretty damned old-fashioned. What we do here is really old-fashioned legacy media. We bring in experts, we interview people, we try to get at the truth. And David's role was always, and the way he approached it always, was to educate, inform, and very slightly entertain in a very Reithian kind of mould. We brought all that together under one roof. It was never about ego, never about the host, and his style was always to draw out the conversation, the observation, the feelings of the interviewees, to cast light, to seek the truth, and to be very, very thoughtful in doing so. And the thing that surprised all of us, and I know actually surprised David as much as anything else, because he'd look at the reader figures and go, I'm still in shock, I still can't believe this. And it turns out there is a massive thirst for that kind of thing. We are told again and again that traditional media is dead, that we can't survive in a world of fake news and clickbait, TikToks and deliberate misinformation. But you know what? Look at our downloads, our listener figures, all of that. There is a huge, huge thirst for those basic principles of what good journalism is. It hasn't changed with the technology at all. And it's, I don't know, maybe with David's passing, that has really, really brought home to me. And I am getting to the end, Francis. Thank you for indulging me in these thoughts. But that also brings me to a last thing about David, which is his leadership. David was 10 years younger than me. I used to rib him about being a kind of 21-year-old millennial. Look at your witless for fun. But for God's sake, in his manner and his gentleness, you didn't realise you were being led. But now he's gone, I'd realise we were all looking to him for a kind of leadership. And I'm kind of indebted to James Rothwell for making this point, actually. This leadership, which was never you do that, it was a kind of example and reminding you of what was possible. And his own dedication. I had to take some time off work about a year ago. And when I came back, David had another one of his podcast babies. It's Battle Lines, which I hope some of our listeners know. It's a bit of a spin-off of Ukraine. It's about conflict. It's about international war and stuff. But it was another David Knowlesian baby. Which means it was on a shoestring. It had no budget at all. It was put together by myself and David and Venetia and David Dagharry with in between our other work. I don't know how we do it, but gloriously experimental. It's like, one of our planning meetings this last Tuesday with David, he was saying, we can do anything with this. And we should. And that was the glorious thing about him. So I don't think he was for a moment aware of anything like this. I don't think he was aware of how much he was loved. I don't think he was aware of just how much he'd achieved and the impact he'd made on us all. But strangely enough, David, you've made me think about doing my own work more seriously as a result. I'm thinking about my own work more seriously than I have for a long time because of you. We came in yesterday and we all agreed we were going to go at all guns blazing because that's what you'd have wanted. And I try to be a bit flippant. I believe in a stiff upper lip, but this is a week of big emotions, and there are times in life when you brush up against the profound, and this is one of them. So, David, in death you've brought also an immense amount of joy. There's a sense in this newsroom that I have never encountered before and probably won't again, of being united in grief, but also in love. And to be honest, a great amount of pride in you and your achievements and just having had the good fortune to have known and worked with you. I will never cease to miss our ambling conversations about anything and everything. I'll have to find someone else to wander across the newsroom to talk nonsense to when I don't actually want to do any work. Rest easy, my friend.
Roland, thank you very much for that beautiful tribute, which I know many of our listeners will find incredibly moving, as I just did. And I should say that the Archbishop of Canterbury himself has expressed condolences and has asked to message David's family. And of course, we will make sure that happens. And just one thing I would add, it just speaks to David's incredible character that I once asked him, and this was very recent, this was probably only in the last fortnight. I said, when this war is over, David, what are you going to do? And the world, of course, was David's oyster in terms of journalism and foreign investigation. He could have done anything. But I know it was his intention to see the war through to the end with this podcast and his general reporting. And he said, I think I might like to run the social media of a classical orchestra for a while. Doesn't that say so much? But Tom, you've waited incredibly patiently. And as always, it was David who felt it was important that our guests had the final word. So any reflections from you on anything that we've covered today? Tom, over to you.
Thank you. It's going to be very difficult to follow that extremely profound and moving tribute from Roland. What I can say is that there is one place in the world where they understand loss and the death of talented young people, it is here in Ukraine. We should say for a start that David was very well respected and well admired in Ukraine. I've seen so many tributes to him from my Ukrainian friends. One of the things I think that they praised the most was not even so much a specific piece of reporting, but his consistency. The fact that every single day there was news coming out in the West about Ukraine with reliable, verifiable information that kept Ukraine in the news cycle. For that, in an industry where people can be distracted by the ups and downs of various events all over the world, David and your podcast stuck to Ukraine. Even when, there was no big advance or big new invasion like in Kyiv, or there wasn't a Kakhovka Dam or a fall of a big city that everyone would be glued to. Just going back to the subject again and again, reminding Ukrainians that they weren't being forgotten. I would also say here that absolutely everybody has their own equivalent of David, which is a young, talented person taken away before their time. For me, it's my good friend Arman Soldan, the Bosnian AFP journalist who was tragically killed in Chasiv Yar last year. Again, he was an extraordinary character he spoke many languages. He was talented in all types of journalism. He was a fanatical football fan. And he was also just one of the people who was the most kindest and open and generous with his time possible. And if I can link link it to that, it just seems that often these tragedies are so cruel because there is no particular rhyme or reason to get for these people to be taken before their time. And Ukrainians have been through so much loss and so much pain that they know that the only things to do are to be able to celebrate the person's life, take those things that the person worked towards and keep working towards them, to give each other as much support and comfort and shoulders to cry on as possible, and just to make the promise that even if they're gone, you'll continue to honour their work and their memory. And I think I'll leave it at that.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing you stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. As the disinformation war continues, we are relying on your support just as much as ever. You can get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message, especially at the moment. You can also contact us directly on X, formerly known as Twitter. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Giles Gear. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Knowles.